I think Ms. Arona is quite a broad topic to discuss, but I just take cue from both Mr. Ba and Omi, and I've identified within the team that there is a gap, and the gap that exists is quite a big gap, and perhaps that tells us why we are still where we are. And what I want to say is, in the Gambia, what is lacking is strategic partnership. In this country, and I take cue from the very first assignment I had when I joined the Port Authority in 1998, by my late boss, by Ibrahim Jagana, may he rest in perfect peace. The first assignment he gave me was to identify who are the port stakeholders. I came up with a write-up, and I had about 52 in my list. I went to his office and said, no, this is not even half. And I began to wonder where I should be heading to. What that taught me was that I needed to consult with people who were around before me to be able to identify who are the stakeholders. I did that, and we ended up with a list of about 103 stakeholders, and that was acceptable for him. When I moved to my next assignment at the Investment Promotions Agency at GAIPA, then we realized that in order for us to facilitate effectively and meaningfully investment, we need to identify also our stakeholders. And one of the key strategic direction that we took was to identify who GAIPA stakeholders were. Then we'll be able to forge partnerships and relationships. And the first we thought of was Gambia Chamber of Commerce. At the time, my brother, Mr. Almami Fanting Tal, was there. And we began to establish some very meaningful discussions and signed memorandum of understanding to be able to work together as a government institution and a private sector institution. So we began thinking about public-private partnership, which is very key in our development agenda, but which I also think is really lacking in the Gambian industry. Tourism is one of the biggest sectors of the economy, contributing meaningfully to GDP. But if you look at tourism as a sector, the players in tourism, the role that government plays in tourism, I think is most of the time overboard. Tourism is everybody's business. But if I quote from Milton Friedman, he said, the business of business is business. So that means government has no place in tourism as a business partner. All it should do is to create the enabling environment for the private sector to take it and move with it. What I'm trying to drive here is that our private sector players need to come together and identify amongst themselves how do we work together and forge a stronger partnership. And that will support the growth of tourism and will ensure that it forces government to come up with the right policies that will support the businesses. A case in example, when we discuss the issues of high cost of electricity, the high cost of taxes, air accesses, government creates this enabling environment, and also government comes to play a role in this. If we forge partnerships and we become very strong partners, our partnership will drive government to adopt the policies that will drive our businesses, rather than we allow government to set the policies and drive the agenda. We need to come together as people, as country, to identify how we can work together and bring in the businesses that are needed to develop the industries. As a country, there are various associations within the tourism industry. The hotels, for instance, tour operators, grand tour operators, small-scale enterprises. But what is lacking in all these associations, if we look at the number of businesses that perhaps have been registered as small-scale enterprises, like we just have some new startups, I can bet that 50 to 60% of these businesses have not registered to be a member of ASET. So we are operating as stand-alone individual businesses. Will our voices heard by government? Can the required support be for individual, or is it better to come into an association or partnership and send a request for support through the government policies? Today, we have about 3 different associations called, you have Travel and Tourism Associations, you have Ground Tour Operator Association A and B. Do we really need that? Why not we come together? And amongst ourselves, we can identify our individual partners. Both Mr. Ba and Umi had talked about the collapse of Thomas Cook. And what has the collapse of Thomas Cook thought of? They've mentioned them. That is dependency on tour operators. We have our own Gambian tour operators who have got license to be even a UK tour operator. How do we come together to actualize us owning the tour operator business owned by Gambians, driven by Gambians, and to be benefited by Gambians? What we do is we leave this in the hands of foreign players. And what does the foreign players do? They come, form an association, come to Gambia, establish their businesses, take the cream of the tourism industry, take all the foreign exchange they had brought in back to their respective country. And we, as a country, what do we get? Absolutely or almost nothing, because we are not taking advantage of the opportunities that our country, our economies have provided to us. The Gambia is a signatory and a member of various international associations like the UNWTO and others. That's the government policy. But what is quite critical and very important is how do we bridge that gap? How do we come together as a country? Currently, there are needs in air access. Government has come up with a task force to establish an air access task force to look at what is needed. The air access task force, what they're doing is basically not reinventing the wheel. This has been already established and created by the Tourism Development Master Plan. In the Tourism Development Master Plan, there are 13 technical reports. And one of the reports was the establishment of an air access. And in the establishment of an air access, the key is to establish a national carrier. Do we leave this in the hands of government to establish a national carrier, or should we come together as Gambian and register and establish a carrier owned by the private sector through joint venture agreement, either through a public-private partnership or a public-public partnership, or an SPV, special purpose vehicle, where we create an entity and eventually other private players may be interested and we buy shares and move on the industry. I think tourism as a sector should be in the hands more under the private sector than the government taking control of the tourism. All the issues that have been identified here are issues of very important in the drive of tourism. But what is happening is, in the past years, from the First Republic to the Second Republic and now on the Third Republic, we have allowed government to take the leadership, the leadership role in the drive of the tourism sector. We have key private sector players, but these private sector players are most of the time in an individualistic way. And the only way we can be heard is when we come together as people, as private sector, and take the ownership of the industry. Government does not own the industry. Government should provide the enabling environment for private sector to take the leadership and administration of the tourism industry. And what does government do? Only becomes a regulator. Now, in the event of these things, and many years from the First Republic to the Republic, we have not been able to do. And most of the time, when through engagements and discussion were said, in quote, dictatorship. We are now 3 years into full democratic dispensation. What are we still doing? Are we still leaving the businesses of tourism into the hands of government, or should we come together and forge partnerships and agreements to develop the tourism sector? I think days are gone when we begin and continue to blame in the past dictatorship regimes for what has happened to this country. The history books have written that. We now move forward. How do we move forward? How do we move forward? Tourism as a sector, the way forward. What is the way forward? Do we have to remain stagnant, allowing government develop the policies, develop the strategies, and run the industry? Or should we just government come and do either written or policy pronunciations, and we come together as private sector and take the industry and move it forward? I think this is the way forward. And to start with, we as Gambians should begin to own our industry. We as Gambians should be able to identify how we can build our synergies and bridge the gap, because the gap is very wide. But with the support of government policies, we need not sit for government to pronounce an incentive package. We dictate what level of support should government give to us. The only way we can do that is when we come together. And we can only come together when we begin to think and rethink what kind of strategic partnership we forge as people, as a country, as private sector. I think the most used buzzword in the private sector as the engine of economic growth. But in the Gambia, that's not what's happening. Government still controls, government still regulates, government still dictates to the private sector the do's and the don'ts. I don't bore you with long statements on this matter, because it's an open secret. The way forward is for the private sector to take the ownership, and we begin to form strategic partnership as the way forward in the tourism development in this country. Thank you very much.